today. A lot has changed over the last 30 years that's made the evidence of human influences on the climate, of global warming, even stronger and stronger. But the solutions are still much as we talked about 30 years ago. We've just spent 30 years getting more and more evidence and trying to persuade policymakers, business and industry, and even communities that action is needed. What I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is give a brief overview of the science of climate change, the impacts, and the choices that we can make or need to make in terms of determining the future of the planet. That one's okay. We had two, but now we've only got one, so that's fine. I was looking there and thinking, oh, it's gone. But no, it's only on this side.
Impact of climate change.
No, I'm very happy. We'll just work with one screen and then I don't have to point two ways at once. The choices that I'm going to talk about are the choices around the future that we want for ourselves and for our planet. And the choices are essentially between those two images. On the left-hand image, we have a global environment and in fact a global climate, which is as much as possible like we have at present. Unfortunately, the right-hand image is a very different global environment and potentially a very different global climate associated with what is often described as business as usual activity. And for most of us, if we were asked which of those would be our preference for living in, it's not so hard to find unless you talk to some business leaders who would like to have business as usual activity and the left-hand world. And those are inconsistent. So what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the background and what we can head towards. Is it possible to dim the lights at the front here? That image is in fact from 5 years ago. It's a satellite image centered on, and by chance centered on, Bangkok. And it's hard to see because
Excuse me.
somewhere, there's the Indian continent, there's the Middle East, here's Australia, there's the Malaysian Peninsula, and Bangkok is under cloud. It's not always under cloud, but that image already shows the impact of human activity, the lights that you can see from space. And we live in an era, a geological era, that is loosely called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene because human activity is already having as big an impact on the global environment as natural processes. We can see the clear evidence of human activity in many aspects of the planet, not just lights.
You asked for the light over there.
I wanted the lights up here. That's all right. It was fine before. All I wanted was the lights up here to dim. So in terms of sustainability and sustainable development, what we've got to think about is what that means in a range of different definitions. The most recent descriptions of sustainable development are in fact in terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But the first definitions of sustainable development, I thought, were from the Brundtland report and study, which talked about sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations, as well as younger people. And I am so pleased to have some younger people in the audience here, because it's not grey-haired people like myself which are going to be most affected by climate change. It is young people and future generations. But there is, in fact, a US president, not the current US president, but one from 100 years ago, who talked about the US Bill of Rights and the context of sustainable development. Although we didn't realise at the time he was talking about sustainable development. But what he was doing was talking about what does, the words from the US Bill of Rights, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, what does that mean? And in fact, this is from a book that Roosevelt wrote, published in 1916. And what he is really saying is that the greatest number of people applies to all the people across all time. Compared to which those people now alive are a tiny fraction. And it's our duty, current generations, to have a responsibility to all people, not just the current ones alive, but all future generations, including unborn generations. And that duty or responsibility bids us to restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of those unborn generations. I hope that the current US president is aware of this quote, but I don't think he appears to be aware of it, because his view is about making America great again, but seems to be in terms of ignoring this. So what I'm going to do now is talk about evidence of climate change, global warming, the science evidence and what has happened, as well as the impacts and the adaptation. This is a graph of global average temperature at the surface across as much of the globe as we have data for from 1850 right up to the present. We can see large year-to-year variations. In fact, in here, there are in fact 5 different lines from different methods or approaches for analysing the data. What we can see is they all agree. There are some slight differences. Almost everyone who looks at that would say that there has been pronounced warming. It's also important, and you can't see it unless you look at the original, that is 1 degree above pre-industrial warming levels. We are already have global warming of more than 1 degree. And yes, there is substantial year-to-year variability, but unless an asteroid hits the planet, we are not going to have global temperatures below 1 degree in the foreseeable future. Now, we don't want an asteroid, but we won't have cooling to back to 1 degree within the foreseeable future. I mean, within probably 1,000 years. It might be only 100 years, depending on what we do. In addition to the temperature rise, we can see the impact on sea level. And I think we already heard from KK that one of the biggest impacts of climate change is the rise in sea level. And that graph again shows increases over the last 130 years from 1880. And most people would say it hasn't risen much. It's only about that much, 20 centimetres. It's due to melting of ice on land and the warming of ocean waters. I'll show soon what we're projecting in the future, but already that has led to major impacts. In addition, we've seen major increases in carbon dioxide. And what this graph shows is over the last 1,000 years, a relatively flat or constant carbon dioxide concentration. And then something happened around the late 1700s or 1800s such that carbon dioxide has rapidly increased. It was flat and then it increased. The important thing to understand is that that change has not been due to natural processes. It's been due to industrial activity, land clearing, and primarily burning of fossil fuels. And how do we know that? Because this other graph, which shows a plummeting of a different metric, is what is called the fraction of carbon dioxide associated with carbon 13 to carbon 12. And what that carbon 13 isotopic ratio shows is how much of the carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere is due to photosynthetically processed carbon. And that demonstrates that the increase is due to burning fossil fuels and land clearing, all due to human activity. It's not natural emissions associated with, say, the warming of the ocean, which has been discussed by some scientists. But it's critically important to understand is when we look at this graph, for most of the last millennium, the concentrations were below 300 parts per million, but now they're at 405 parts per million of carbon dioxide alone. And when we look at that in terms of all the combined greenhouse gases, we're actually very close to 500 parts per million equivalent of CO2. We have already increased the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere sufficient to lead to somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees of warming. That's what we have already without any future emissions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Now, if we have a warming of the climate system, the impacts are not primarily associated with the slow and steady global warming. The impacts are primarily associated with changes in extreme events. And the long-term warming changes the frequencies of a range of extreme events. If the atmosphere gets warmer, it can hold more moisture, so that when it rains, you get heavier rainfall. And we have very clear evidence of increases in heavy 1 day and 1 hour extreme rainfall events. And we see some of those impacts in India, in Bangladesh, and throughout Southeast and South Asia. We also see it in other regions. Even dry countries like Australia are seeing significant impact in extreme 1 hour and 1 day heavy rainfall events. Even though, in fact, in Australia, in some regions, there have been increases in droughts in southern Australia, as well as increases in heavy rain events, which seems strange. But we can have both, because droughts are long-term and heavy rainfall can happen, not at the same time, but will have major impacts. The biggest and most obvious impact of global warming is increases in heat waves and hot extremes. And we're seeing that all around the world as well. In addition, long-term global warming and long-term sea level rise leads to increases in storm surges and flooding associated with tropical cyclones. It doesn't just impact South Asia and Southeast Asia, it also impacts everywhere, all the coastline around the world. And it's when it impacts on Manhattan associated with storm surges from hurricanes affecting the east coast of the United States, that's when business in the United States pays attention. It's also clear that we're losing or reducing the frequency of cold days and cold nights. So we're getting those sorts of impacts already in terms of the climate system for 1 degree of warming. And the governments around the world have agreed to seek to limit warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels at the Paris Agreement in 2015. This week in Korea, there is another rather bigger climate change conference going on. There is a conference of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to undertake an assessment of what are the advantages of limiting global warming to only 1.5 degrees and what are the approaches. There is a special report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees being prepared or finalised this week in Korea, and that will be released on Monday next week. A range of scientists have been involved in both preparing this report and a much bigger group, more than 1,000 involved in reviewing this draft report. It's being approved by intergovernmental representatives or governmental representatives from each country. So each of your countries will have a representative that will be approving this report. There will likely be more than 100 countries present, and getting a report approved unanimously by more than 100 countries will likely mean that this report on the chances of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be somewhat conservative. So just be aware if you download it on Monday that what it says will likely be conservative. I'll try a little bit later to give the clearer perspective. What I'm going to do now is talk about future climate change and projections. And there are 2 different scenarios that I'm going to talk about. Essentially a business as usual scenario where the chances of warming projections at the end of this century, and then this scenario here, which is a low emission scenario. What will happen, what is likely to happen, and the uncertainties in global temperatures in 2100. So let's look at the low emission scenario first of all. So the first thing to understand is that these are global temperatures relative to essentially the end of the 20th century. So it's essentially relative to 1995. We already know that we had about 0.8 of a degree warming by 1995, so you have to add 0.8 of a degree to each of these. And where does it line up? Well, this mid-range warming is 1 degree in 2100 with substantial uncertainties. But remember, you've got to add 0.8 of a degree to that to look at it relative to pre-industrial. It's 1.8 degrees. There is a reasonable chance of limiting warming to less than 2 degrees, but actually there's a substantial chance that this will get to 1.5, add 0.8 is 2.3. This scenario doesn't guarantee limiting warming below 2 degrees. This one is business as usual. This is countries around the world continuing to release greenhouse gases. And what we see there is warming of mid-range of 4 degrees, up here at 5.5, and add 0.8, it's more than 6 degrees of global warming. Our planet hasn't seen 6 degrees of global warming for more than 50 million years. This scenario leads to a planet at which no humans have ever lived. And I've lost track of when I started. Someone's going to tell me how much time I've got left at some stage. I can talk non-stop underwater. If we look at sea level rise, we also know that increasing temperature, increasing global warming leads to increasing sea level rise. But now we look at the scale and the chances of sea level rise. The mid-range is about 75 centimetres, but again, it's relative to 1995. We already had 20 centimetres. So this leads to best estimates of sea level rise at the end of the current century of about 1 metre. Not this much that we've had already, but 1 metre, more like that. And that leads to dramatic increases in impacts. Someone's going to tell me eventually how much time have I got left? How much time have I used?
So we're enjoying.
Hey, we're almost halfway.
I mean, not the message, but...
Almost another 20 minutes here.
20 minutes left or 20 minutes I've had?
Left 20 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So let's look at what has to happen in terms of greenhouse gases, and particularly greenhouse gas emissions. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. These are a set of different scenarios. This is the rapid emission reduction scenario that leads to limiting global warming at about 2 degrees. And this is the business as usual one. If we want to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, we have to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Remember, I said that we're already at 490 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. Well, this 2 degrees says we have to be between 430 and 480. It's tough when we're already at 493. So it's going to be really, really hard. We have to have negative emission technologies, which means planting more trees, or it means developing new technologies that can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And those technologies don't exist at large scale yet. In terms of sources of greenhouse gases, we hear and talk most about electricity-related emissions, burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, but in fact agriculture, animal agriculture and clearing land are both critically important globally as major sources of emissions. Transport and industrial uses of fossil fuels are also critically important. We cannot solve climate change unless we address all of these different sectors. We can't just choose one because we need to go to zero net emissions sometime before the end of this century. And that means, for some of the younger members in the audience, it means in your lifetimes that we will have to transform society. And we need to start, not in a decade, we need to start today. We need to have started already. There are lots of things that we can do. We already have the technologies. We can use energy more efficiently and save money because we don't have to buy as much electricity. We can switch to low carbon, zero carbon energy sources, solar power or wind power, or potentially even nuclear power in countries for which safe nuclear power options exist. But that's hard. We need to improve sinks of carbon dioxide to extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, either through increasing reforestation, increasing soil uptake of carbon dioxide, or choosing bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where bioenergy is taking waste products and using them to generate electricity. But the other critically important thing we need to do is we need to think about our lifestyles and our behavioural choices. Because we need to reduce consumption. We need to think about reducing consumption and reusing materials because we have a finite resource. We are already seeing not only impacts in terms of the physical climate, but in terms of the ecology. And one of the clearest examples is coral bleaching associated with warmer ocean waters, particularly in tropical regions. This is affecting all the coral reefs around the world, and 1.5 degrees of global warming is likely to lead to dramatically increased frequency of coral bleaching in all the tropical coral reefs around the world. There are lots of impacts. Unfortunately, many of the impacts of global warming affect poorer people and developing countries around the world much more than they affect affluent countries. Food and water shortages are going to be affected by the change in the agricultural zones and the changes in rainfall. There's going to be increased displacement of people associated with sea level rise and increases in heat waves. There will be increases in poverty, and there will be major impacts from coastal flooding, particularly affecting South Asia and Southeast Asia. None of this is good news. There are some countries that may have some benefits from a warmer climate, particularly Northern Hemisphere high latitude countries like Canada, the Soviet Union, or the Scandinavian countries. But even there will be many major adverse impacts as well. If we allow global warming to continue, we know there's going to be bigger impacts. The higher the magnitude of the global warming, the bigger will be the impacts, and many of them will be irreversible. So I already mentioned the Paris Agreement, reached in December of 2015, in which countries agreed to reduce their emissions to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to seek to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The report that I mentioned that will come out on Monday talks about the benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees and what needs to be done. And the conclusion is we need to do a lot more than we're doing. Every country needs to increase their ambition in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And we need to ensure that we increase the ability to adapt to the climate change which is in place already. So where are we now? How much are we on track? Well, this is the recent global emissions. And this is global emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels in industry. It looked as though it had stabilised for a couple of years. Remembering, this does not include emissions from agriculture. It doesn't include emissions of methane or nitrous oxide or other long-lived gases. This is the easiest one to get data for. It's from an organisation called the Global Carbon Project. It looked like emissions had stabilised until 2017, and they've increased even further in 2018. So that's good news and bad news. What about different countries? Well, some countries that started with very high emissions, like Australia or the United States, have been reducing their per capita emissions. Per capita emissions is one of the best ways to look at the relative equity of emissions. And here is the United States, there is Europe. Chinese emissions have rapidly increased, and they're now higher per person than European emissions. And here is the emissions from India, still very low but increasing. It is important to understand that in terms of the simplest measure of equity of emissions, per person emissions is the easiest way to think about it. But how are we tracking relative to these different scenarios? Well, here's the 2-degree scenario down here, and we're above it. In fact, it's a decision to make climate change worse. So the IPCC assessment that's happening this week will not be talking about choices between which level of warming and describing the high emissions as deciding to make the problem worse. But that framing is exactly what allowing continued greenhouse gas emissions at present rates means. My recommendation is that we make choices to reduce emissions as rapidly as possible. And that should be done by the countries that are contributing most to the problems, which is the countries with the highest emissions. Australia is the developed country with the highest per capita emissions. In fact, higher than the United States. So I am a representative of the most guilty country. Unfortunately, the Australian emissions are growing at present, unlike the US emissions. Why? Because Australia does not currently have a policy on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we do have the means to limit climate change and to build a prosperous and more sustainable future. This was true when this report came out in 2014. It is still true. We just need to do a lot more. And what we need to do is to make a choice between the planet on the left-hand side, which are global temperature changes in 2100 with substantial emission reduction, and warming limited to less than 2 degrees. On the right-hand side is that business as usual scenario, warming globally of 4.5 degrees, but actually look at the countries. Land warms up faster than the oceans. And so Australia and India and Europe all have warming greater than 6 degrees. Even in this scenario, we still see land warming up faster than the oceans, and many countries with warming greater than 2 degrees, even though globally the global average temperature is limited to less than 2 degrees, but in fact the land temperature, on average, is much more like 2.5 or 3 degrees. We have a choice. We also have an opportunity to try to influence government policies and business policies around the world. I look forward to the opportunity to talk with you all at this meeting. There are many, many opportunities in the future as well. But there's a lot more that needs to be done, and you'll all be presenting different perspectives on this common problem. Global warming isn't the only problem affecting the Earth and its peoples, but it is certainly a pervasive and important one. And I hope that we can join in conversations and discussions about our sustainable future, not only today and tomorrow, but also for the rest of our lives. Thank you. And I think we've got time for questions and discussion. How long have we got? 10 minutes?
Sir, little one, I'm asking on her behalf. I'm asking on her behalf. She just now asked me a question in the tea time, that she would like to know that how do these wars and conflicts, do they also contribute to global warming and climate change? Because she is working for a war-free planet.
Yeah. So, working on a war-free planet is a very, very good objective. Wars themselves, in terms of increased energy emissions, consumption, is relatively small relative to the normal activity. So war itself does not contribute to climate change in a substantial way. In fact, because of impact of climate change in higher temperatures, many military forces are trying to change away from using fossil fuel energy sources to actually become more sustainable. But there are many aspects of climate change, like changes in water resources, like changes in food supply, that can accentuate conflict in many stressed environments. So if through restricted water resources or changes in poverty or increased migration from coastal areas, all of those are likely to lead to increased stresses and may lead to conflict, are likely to lead to conflict. And so there are many countries around the world that have discussed the potential role or the actual role of climate change in leading to cross-border conflict. And that's something we need to try to avoid as much as possible. We'll come here first and then we'll come back.
Okay, climate change is a threat, no doubt. But what do you think about the politicians' willingness to accept this calamity? Is I say worse than even this climate change itself. Look at this. Look at the agreements of Paris Agreement. What is the agreement we have? All is questionable because of Trump's behavior. So this is absolutely is working in the sense that you're working behind to reach a consensus, and suddenly the political will of the politicians jeopardizing the whole thing. So this is that's the major threat. They need to be made aware of that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that, first of all, the United States has not withdrawn from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and has not withdrawn from the Paris Agreement yet. Even though they've said they're going to withdraw, it actually takes time to go through the UNFCCC processes. And in any case, the US emissions are falling. So Trump hasn't yet had a big enough influence on the US economy or the US energy systems so that US emissions grow. They aren't. So there are other countries.
Not just an example in USA, but look at China and Australia had a green tax.
Oh, absolutely. So the best example, and the one that I'm most familiar with, is Australia. Australia says it's going to meet its Paris commitments, but there are no ways, no policies in Australia, no approaches. So you're absolutely right. What needs to happen is that people like myself, people like yourself, people who are monitoring what's happening in each country needs to ensure that countries, their own countries and other countries, are meeting their Paris commitments. And you're absolutely right. It is clear that Australia is way off track in terms of honouring its commitments. You can't reduce your emissions, or should I say you can't meet a commitment to reduce your emissions by at least 26 to 28% while emissions are increasing. And so I have no idea what Australia is planning to do.
But you planned a green tax actually, carbon tax before.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And there was an election, and associated with some media by the Murdoch press, Fox News, they lobbied and basically misinformed the public that the carbon tax was expensive. It wasn't, it was tiny, and the Australian population voted out one government and implemented another one, and that new government basically phased out the carbon price. You're absolutely right. That was one of the best examples of the effectiveness of a carbon price. While there was a carbon price, Australian emissions fell, and as soon as it was wiped out, Australian emissions have increased each year since 2014. So in that sense, Australia is the best or the worst example of the effectiveness of carbon pricing and the ineffectiveness when you remove carbon pricing. But That's an economic discussion. You had a question.
So why is it that if I have a proposal to grow forest-based business, nobody supports me? And if I have a mobile app, everybody gives me money. Why is it?
That's a very, very good question for which there's no simple answer. It's easy for some people to talk about the benefits of information technology and mobile apps, but actually funding and supporting the benefits of rebuilding or replanting forests, enhancing forest growth, replacing deforested areas, it requires a lot of effort.
That means our economy is going towards the wrong direction.
That's correct. It is, because there are multiple benefits from increasing forest growth. It enhances biodiversity and ecosystems. It has added benefits from limiting flooding in areas along the rivers. It has the additional benefits of uptaking carbon dioxide. So there are lots and lots of benefits, lots and lots of reasons why it should be supported. But unfortunately, not just in India, but in many other countries around the world, there are favoured projects and areas, and environmental and related ones are often not as, how would I say, as supported. There was another question at the back as well.
Thank you. Considering the seriousness of these climate change issues, isn't it maybe high time we have the conventions related to climate change not being like conventions or treaties, but something, I don't know, maybe having a status that will force all countries to be part of, instead of countries having, you know, to choose, discretion to choose whether to be part of the treaties or not, because it's affecting the whole globe.
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, the United Nations has a number of treaties with penalties, but the penalties are almost impossible to enforce. There were treaties under the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention. The Paris Agreement is also a treaty. It has, well, the Kyoto Protocol had penalties, but they were never implemented and they were never enforced. Same with the Paris Agreement. Under the United Nations, intergovernmental agreements are virtually impossible to enforce. So it's only by national and international goodwill that these sorts of conventions or treaties can have any impact. And that means trying to, through diplomacy and argument, it's only through those and the power of communities lobbying, as well as businesses lobbying, to point out the advantages of acting on climate change and the disadvantages of not acting. And some of the biggest ones, and the biggest influences, are now coming from the business sector. Almost all multinational businesses are anticipating a $50 a tonne price on carbon by 2030 or earlier. They're using that for their economic planning, not because there'll be a real price, but there'll be an effective price. But you're absolutely right. What is needed is stronger adherence to all the agreements, and we know that not just for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but for many other ones, countries choose which of the UN conventions they follow and ignore other ones. And so it's harder to encourage, if you like, adherence with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change than it is for conventions which have relatively less impact. Is it time to finish, or are we still going on? Maybe it'll be two last questions. How about we get them both? There's going to be another day and 3/4 or day and a half. I'm not going away.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Asad. I'm from Bangladesh and working with BRAC, one of the largest NGOs in the world. So since I'm from Bangladesh, so you know, we are talking about mitigation, but Bangladesh has very little to do with mitigation because our per capita emission is less than half a ton. So my question would be, so what are the impactful measures you or scientists or policymakers taking in terms of financing in adaptation field? Because countries like Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, so we have to focus on adaptation than mitigation. So, and we are the victims. So what are you doing from your end to ensure that GCF works properly or other framework works properly? Thank you very much.
What I am doing both within Australia and through international fora is to try to do all of the three things in the Paris aim, to lobby Australia and other countries to reduce emissions, to lobby Australia in particular to enhance climate change adaptation. But I agree with you that Australia and other developed countries also need to meet the obligations to support and engage in the financial commitments to the Global Climate Fund, and to do it seriously, rather than to just treat it as, what I say, with very low commitments. And it means that if it's done in a way that supports both sustainable futures as well as adaptation to climate change, as well as providing renewable energy sources, all of those are of significant benefit because they can address more energy production in developing countries as well as climate change adaptation and can transition society. However, there are examples of some countries, and mine is a prime example, where the Australian government has been trying to promote increased coal burning power stations in India to sell more Australian coal, and that is the worst thing possible. First of all, it commits India to increasing its emissions. Secondly, it commits India to more air pollution, which will affect the local population, and globally it leads to increases in emissions. So there are no reasons why Australia should be promoting.
Actually, you see the global hypocrisy two-way.
I see it enormously, and I talk about it, but that doesn't make me popular in Australia.
Okay, this is the last question.
The last one.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your flawless and nice presentation. I am sure everyone enjoyed your informative presentation. I am working on climate change adaptation in Bangladesh, although I am a student from UTS, University of Technology, Sydney. I am doing PhD, and my focus is on female contribution on local knowledge and social capital in climate change adaptation. So my question is it's a very simple question, and it is your concluding message. You said we should limit climate change adaptation. So my question is, from your opinion, how do we can limit this climate change adaptation? I want to know from your opinion. Yes.
So I'm not quite sure whether I said limit climate change adaptation. I think we want to limit global warming
Yeah.
and enhance climate change adaptation so that we can limit the impacts. Now, the best way to do that is often adaptation to climate change cannot be done at a national level as a whole. Often the impacts of climate change are local manifestations of the impacts of global warming. So what that means is that adaptation often has to be done at a local or regional level, not at a national or continental level. Some cases, for instance, associated with limiting in Bangladesh coastal flooding, there may be some aspects, some initiatives that can be done around the whole country. But in practice, those initiatives, whether it's engineering structures, whether it's replanting mangroves, whether it's changing boundaries for population development, all of those have to be done at a local or city or regional level. And so that means that it becomes much more complicated because you've got to involve lots and lots of groups rather than just dealing with one administrative or organisational body. So often when we think about this or talk about it, climate change mitigation, reducing emissions, can be implemented often by national policy. But climate change mitigation often has to be implemented not at a national level, but at a local or regional level in terms of policies and decisions at a range of different scales, and that makes it quite difficult.
So that's why I would like to say local knowledge is very much important to
Yes.
share the knowledge from the locally to national and international level.
Yep. And I completely agree with you on that. And on the one other area, on gender issues,
Yes, right.
it is critically important that women are actively engaged in all aspects of decision making on climate change, because population growth is also a contributing factor to climate change, and limiting the rate of growth of population in all countries is a factor that can reduce increases in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, a major reason is like the displacement of the male members. They are displacing to the city, and women are being alone in the coastal area. So there is no other way to survive with the climate change, and so that's why female contribution is important to climate change adaptation area. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And as I said, we're going to have lots of time for more discussions. Otherwise, we'll be here until dinner time, not lunchtime. So I will come and talk to you at lunchtime.
Tiikm, the International Institute of Knowledge Management.